He started leaving food out because he couldn't bear watching it starve. Night after night the bear came, quiet, steady, respectful. But one morning he found something waiting for him on the porch. Not food. Not danger. Something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The nights in Pine Hollow had grown quieter since his wife passed. No laughter echoing from the porch, no radio hum from the kitchen window, just the rasp of wind and the creak of the pines leaning against the cabin walls. Walter had learned to live with silence, but silence never learned to live with him. Every evening he'd take his supper alone on the porch, beans, bread, a bit of stew. The forest stretched out beyond his yard like a living ocean, each gust of wind carrying whispers of unseen life. He liked it that way. Until one night, when something else began breathing just beyond the lantern light. It started with sounds, faint at first. The crunch of leaves. The slow exhale of something large. A shadow shifting in the tree line. He froze mid-bite, eyes narrowing toward the woods. Then he saw it, a broad shape, heavy and dark, lumbering between the birches. The unmistakable silhouette of a bear. Most men in Pine Hollow would have grabbed a rifle. Walter didn't. He just watched, and the bear watched back. For a long, silent minute, neither moved. Then the bear turned and vanished into the blackness as quietly as it had come. The next morning Walter found the trash bin overturned, nothing shredded, just opened, rummaged. Not out of rage but hunger. He sighed, gathered the scraps and muttered under his breath, "If you're that hungry you could have just asked." That night he did something strange, something no neighbor would understand. He placed a plate of leftover stew on the porch railing and whispered to the trees, "Let's see if you're polite enough to return the favor." He didn't expect it to disappear. But when he stepped outside the next morning, the plate was spotless. Licked clean, not cracked, not broken. Just clean. It became a rhythm. Every night, he'd leave something, a crust of bread, an apple core, a half-empty bowl of soup. Every morning the food was gone, neatly taken. Not once did the bear break a window, scatter trash, or scratch the porch. Weeks passed like that, the fear dissolving into curiosity. He started talking to it through the dark. "Evening, neighbor," he'd call out softly, his voice steady but kind. He never saw the bear up close, just glimpses, a shoulder here, a shimmer of fur there, always keeping its distance as if respecting his boundaries. One night, while the crickets hummed and the lantern flickered low, Walter decided to test something. He stepped onto the porch holding a pan of cooked fish. The smell drifted heavy through the air. From the tree line, a shadow emerged, slow, cautious, deliberate. The bear. It stopped just at the edge of light, breathing heavy. Walter could see the fog of its breath in the cold air. For a moment, fear tried to speak, that old instinct that says run, that ancient whisper every man inherits. But Walter didn't move. He set the pan down gently on the step. The bear hesitated, then stepped forward. The wooden boards creaked under its weight. Its eyes caught the lamplight, not wild, not red, just tired. The same tiredness Walter saw in his own reflection every morning. It sniffed the pan, looked at him once, and ate slowly, noiselessly. Walter stayed still, his heart racing but steady enough to feel peace. He realized then, this wasn't a predator meeting a man. It was two lonely creatures crossing the same silence, sharing warmth without needing words. When the bear finished, it turned back toward the woods. But before disappearing into the dark, it paused, looked back at him once more, then vanished beyond the trees. That was the first time Walter slept without the radio on. That was the first night Pine Hollow felt alive again. The next morning Walter opened his door as usual, and froze. The plate was there. But beside it, on the wooden step, lay something new, something he hadn't put there. A small object, perfectly placed as if the forest itself had left him a message. If you were in Walter's place, alone, miles from anyone, would you have kept feeding the bear, or stopped the moment it came close? What do you think the bear left behind on that porch? The morning air bit at Walter's skin as he stepped barefoot onto the porch. The mist still clung to the pine branches and the ground shimmered with dew. For a moment he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. There it was, the plate empty as always. But beside it lay something else. A pine cone. Not an ordinary one, this one was strange. Its scales were arranged around a perfect little stone, smoothed by time and river water. It looked placed. Not dropped. Placed. Walter crouched slowly, his knees groaning against the cold wood. The object was deliberate. Too deliberate to be coincidence. He glanced toward the forest, quiet, empty, still. He let out a small laugh, the kind that comes from disbelief and awe. "Well," he murmured, "guess I'm not the only one saying thank you." For the first time in months, he felt warmth that had nothing to do with coffee or fire. That evening, he placed another plate, this time with a few pieces of cooked meat and berries. But he also did something else. He picked a small round stone from the creek behind the cabin, smooth, pale, almost white, and set it beside the plate. A quiet trade. A human version of whatever this was. He didn't expect anything to happen that night. But around midnight, the sound came again. Heavy steps brushing against the gravel path, the creak of the porch boards. Walter didn't move. He stayed inside, sitting by the window, the glow of the lantern barely lighting the curtain's edge. Through that thin slice of glass he saw it, the bear standing in the pale moonlight. It sniffed the air, then lowered its head to eat. Its movements were careful, almost ceremonial. When it finished, it sniffed the small white stone, and nudged it gently with its nose. Then it turned and disappeared back into the forest. In the morning, Walter found the stone gone. In its place, another object. A piece of wood hollowed by age with claw marks etched in a spiral pattern. Not random scratches but deliberate lines looping inward as if drawn. Walter sat down on the porch step, the air heavy with pine and wonder. He turned the wood over in his hands, feeling its grooves. Each mark felt like a signature, the forest's handwriting, the bear's quiet gesture of recognition. It was absurd, he thought. And yet it made more sense than most human things. He began to notice changes in himself too. He stopped closing the curtains at night. He started walking deeper into the woods, tracing the paths where he'd seen the bear's footprints. He even fixed up the old bird feeder, smiling at how the world suddenly felt full again, full of watching eyes, beating hearts, quiet company. The people in town noticed too. "Looks like you've got your color back," the store clerk said when he came in for supplies. "Must be the forest air," Walter replied, smiling. He didn't mention the bear. They wouldn't understand. They'd turn the story into a warning, another reason to carry a gun instead of a loaf of bread. That night, he left something new on the porch, a handful of apples and the hollow wooden piece the bear had left behind, returning it as a gesture of mutual respect. He whispered to the darkness, "Your turn." The wind shifted. The pines groaned. Somewhere deep in the woods he thought he heard a low rumble, not threatening, not close, just an acknowledgement. He smiled, went inside, and for the first time in years, left the porch light burning through the night. By dawn the apples were gone. But when Walter stepped outside, something else was waiting, not on the porch this time, but hanging from the porch railing, wedged between two boards. It wasn't food. It wasn't wood or stone. It was a piece of torn fabric, and it smelled faintly of smoke. Walter held the piece of fabric between his fingers, the thread still damp from dew. It wasn't torn clean, it was shredded as though ripped by claws. But what struck him most wasn't the damage. It was the smell. Smoke. Not the kind from his chimney, this was heavier, darker. The scent of something burned, maybe close, maybe not. He raised his eyes toward the tree line, and for the first time in weeks, the forest didn't feel calm. It felt alert. He turned the fabric over again. It was flannel, red and gray human fabric. A shirt maybe. Someone had been out there. That afternoon the wind shifted. He noticed it as he split wood behind the cabin, the faint, bitter sting carried on the breeze. He looked up, and beyond the ridge, a thin column of gray rose through the trees. "Not again," he muttered. The last wildfire had nearly taken Pine Hollow 6 years ago. Since then everyone stayed cautious, no campfires, no sparks near the dry brush. But this smoke didn't look accidental. It looked contained, like someone's camp gone wrong. Walter set down his axe, grabbed his jacket and started toward the ridge. The forest closed around him as he climbed, each step crunching through layers of pine needles and old leaves. The smoke grew thicker, curling around the trunks like ghosts. Then he saw it, a small clearing, the remains of a campfire still smoldering. A charred backpack. A few scattered tins. And beside them, more torn fabric. He crouched, inspecting the ashes. Whoever had been here left in a hurry. The air smelled of panic. Then a sound. A low, rolling growl, not hostile but deep enough to vibrate through his chest. Walter turned slowly, his breath clouding in the cold air. The bear stood at the edge of the clearing. Massive, still, watching him with those same dark, reflective eyes. Its fur looked singed along one shoulder, a patch of blackened hair where fire had brushed it. Walter took a step back. "You," he whispered. The bear didn't move. It looked toward the smoking campfire, then back at him as if pointing, warning. He followed its gaze and noticed something behind the ashes, the faint glint of metal. He knelt again, brushed away the soot and found a lighter, half melted, still warm. The realization hit him like cold water. Someone had been lighting fires in the dry woods. Carelessly. Maybe on purpose. He looked up again and the bear was gone. No sound, no movement, just silence and the faint crackle of dying embers. Walter stood there for a long moment, unsure whether to feel fear or gratitude. The bear hadn't attacked. It had guided. It had brought the warning straight to his doorstep, through that piece of fabric. He returned home before sunset, his boots blackened with ash. On the porch he placed another offering, this time not food. Just a clean towel soaked in cool water, set gently on the step. A small act of kindness for the burn he'd seen on its shoulder. The forest was still that night. No footsteps, no movement. But Walter didn't need confirmation. He knew the bear had understood. He slept lighter than usual, his dreams filled with smoke and fur and the sound of heavy breathing just outside the door. At dawn the towel was gone. In its place, the same hollow piece of wood the bear had once left, but now filled with something new. Wet moss pressed carefully inside, still glistening with water. A healing gift. A returned kindness. Walter smiled. He didn't need to say anything. Some conversations didn't need words at all. Later that afternoon as he chopped wood, a truck pulled into his dirt driveway, the local ranger's vehicle. The man stepped out, dust cloud rising around his boots. "You been up by the ridge?" he asked. Walter nodded. Ranger Shaw's expression turned grave. "We found tracks. Big ones. Bear-sized. But there's something else too, signs of poachers. Armed. You might not be alone up here anymore." Do you think the bear was warning Walter about danger, or simply protecting its own home? At what point does coexistence become an alliance? Ranger Shaw leaned against the hood of his truck, scanning the tree-line. "We found empty shell casings about 2 miles north," he said. "Looks like someone's been hunting illegally. Bears, deer, doesn't matter to them." Walter's jaw tightened. "You think they're still out there?" Shaw nodded. "Could be. We saw a blood trail but not from any animal. Looked human. We'll check again tomorrow." The ranger tipped his hat and drove off, the engine fading into the forest's hush. Walter stood there for a long time, his eyes tracing the dirt road until it vanished into green. His hands twitched, habit telling him to reach for a rifle, instinct telling him to trust what he'd built instead. He looked toward the woods and whispered, "You knew, didn't you?" That evening he didn't put food on the porch. He didn't light his lantern either. He just sat there waiting, the cold creeping under his sleeves. The night grew heavy, the kind that swallowed sound whole. Then he heard it, not the slow, steady rhythm of the bear but something else. Fast. Erratic. Crunching through leaves like a man who didn't belong. He froze. The steps came closer. Then stopped. A faint metallic click broke the silence. A flashlight beam cut through the dark, landing right on his cabin door. Walter ducked low. The beam moved across the porch, lingered on the empty plate, then swept toward the tree-line. A man's voice, hushed and coarse, "Tracks lead right here." Another voice, rougher. "Then we wait. It'll come back." Walter's pulse hammered. They were after his bear. He waited until the light disappeared, then crawled to the window. 2 men stood just beyond the clearing, rifles slung, watching the darkness. Their pickup sat half hidden under the trees, muffler still warm. He could hear one of them mutter, "Easy money? Bearskin this big? That's a payout." Walter's stomach turned. He thought about the plate, the pine cone, the hollow wood, the moss. He thought about the burned fur and the quiet understanding. This wasn't just an animal anymore. It was trust. He had to do something. At dawn the men were still there, half asleep, waiting. Walter crept out behind his cabin, following the narrow trail that cut through the birches. His boots sank into soft earth, every step measured. He reached the small ridge overlooking the clearing where he'd first seen the bear days ago. He crouched behind a fallen log, scanning. Nothing. Just silence. Then, a sound. Low, deep, resonant. The bear stepped into view. It was limping slightly, the burned shoulder still healing. It sniffed the ground, wary. The sunlight painted its fur in copper and gold. For a moment, Walter forgot everything else. The poachers, the risk, the fear. He just watched, humbled by its quiet strength. Then a rifle cracked. The sound split the morning open like thunder. The bear flinched and stumbled backward, roaring, not in pain but rage. Birds exploded from the trees, scattering into the air. Walter didn't think. He ran downhill shouting, "Stop. Don't shoot." The men turned, startled. One aimed again. Walter threw himself between them, shouting, "It's not attacking anyone." "Move, old man," one of them barked. But Walter didn't. His voice came out steady, like a man who'd already lost everything once and wouldn't lose this too. "You're not killing it? Not here. Not today." The men hesitated, lowering their rifles just for a breath, long enough for the bear to retreat into the trees, vanishing like smoke. The one with the scar on his cheek spat into the dirt. "You think it cares about you? You'll see what happens when it comes back hungry." They turned and left, muttering curses, boots grinding gravel. Walter stood alone in the clearing, his heart pounding, breath ragged. The forest was silent again, but not peaceful. Not yet. He looked at the ground where the bear's tracks ended and whispered, "You warned me first. Guess it's my turn now." He followed the tracks deeper, careful and slow, until they disappeared near the creek. There, half hidden under a fallen branch, he found something glinting in the mud. A spent bullet casing, still warm. That night, Walter left the porch light burning again. But when he stepped out with his lantern, he froze. Right at the edge of the clearing, where the forest met the field, two glowing eyes watched him. The bear had returned. But this time it wasn't alone. Behind it, in the shadow, something else moved. The next morning, the porch was empty. The bowl was gone. Not just the food, the entire bowl. Daniel froze at the sight. For weeks, their exchange had followed a rhythm. Food placed, food taken, footprints left. But now the rhythm was broken. There were no paw prints, no sign of disturbance, not even the faint scrape of claws on the step. He looked into the forest. It was still. Too still. Something about the silence unsettled him. Even the usual chatter of birds seemed absent. Daniel took a slow breath and called out softly, "Hey there, big guy, you around?" No response. Only wind, brushing through the dry leaves like whispers fading in an empty room. He waited. Minutes stretched into hours. The sun climbed high, painting the porch in gold, but no shadow crossed it except his own. By evening, the weight of uncertainty pressed heavy on him. Had the bear been hurt? Had someone scared it off? Or worse, had the unspoken trust they built somehow been broken? That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin made him rise, every faint rustle outside sent him to the window. But the forest remained ghostly quiet. The absence felt louder than any growl ever could. When morning came, he decided to look. He followed the narrow trail behind the cabin, moving carefully, the cold air biting at his skin. For the first time, he realized how little he truly knew about the animal that had come so close to his life, and how much it had come to matter. He found the first sign a few hundred meters in, the missing bowl. It was lying beside a fallen log, partly covered in pine needles. The rim was scratched but intact, and beside it, something else caught his eye: berries. A small cluster, freshly picked, placed neatly beside the bowl. Daniel knelt. His breath caught. The realization hit like a wave: the bear brought something back. The gesture was unmistakable. It wasn't random scavenging, not hunger. It was intention. The animal had understood the pattern and responded. Just as Daniel had been offering kindness, the bear had returned a token of its own. He smiled faintly, a strange warmth rising in his chest. There, in that quiet clearing, the boundary between man and wild seemed to blur. Not through words, not through control, but through a silent recognition that both were capable of empathy. Yet something still felt incomplete. Why had the bear not come back itself? Why leave a gift and disappear? The question haunted him as he made his way home, carrying the scratched bowl like something sacred. He placed it back on the porch, added a few apples this time, and whispered, "I got your message, friend." That night, as the forest wrapped itself in darkness again, Daniel sat by the window, candle flickering beside him. He wasn't waiting out of fear anymore, but hope. When a soft shuffle sounded outside, he didn't flinch. He turned slowly, heart pounding, not from dread but from anticipation. The porch creaked, then fell still again. He could only make out a shadow, a large shape that moved with care, pausing at the edge of the light. The bear. But not alone this time. Behind it, smaller shapes moved, two cubs, hesitant but curious, sniffing the edge of the steps. Daniel exhaled, his eyes wide. The truth sank in. All those nights of silence weren't abandonment. The bear hadn't vanished, it had become apparent. And now it had brought its family to the one place it felt safe. The mother bear lowered her head slightly as if acknowledging him, then nudged one cub toward the bowl. The cub clumsily took an apple in its mouth and stepped back. Daniel felt something shift deep inside him, an understanding that kindness doesn't just feed, it multiplies. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched as the three figures turned back toward the forest, fading into the shadows beneath the pines. The porch creaked softly after they were gone, the same old wood, but now it carried a memory that words could never explain. Daniel smiled faintly. "Guess we're both raising something," he murmured, "one cubs in the wild, the other faith in the unseen." For the first time in weeks, Daniel woke with a sense of peace and confusion. The bears had returned. The mystery was resolved, but what replaced it was a question heavier than silence. Should he keep this going? He stared at the bowl, now filled only with apple stems and paw smudges. The cubs had left their mark, innocent and chaotic. Yet beneath the sweetness of their visit, there lingered an unease. Daniel knew enough about nature to understand that familiarity could be dangerous. The more comfortable wild animals became near humans, the more they risked harm, not from kindness but from dependence. As he sat on the steps, coffee steaming in his hands, the forest beyond the porch looked calm, even inviting. But he couldn't shake the feeling that every decision he made from now on would tip the balance between compassion and interference. He thought back to his father's words from years ago, "Wild things don't owe us trust, Danny. If they give it, it's a gift. But if we take it too far, it becomes a debt they can't pay." The words hit harder now than they ever had. That evening, as the light dipped low, Daniel placed one last offering on the porch, only this time it was different. No apples, no leftovers. Just the scratched bowl, clean and empty. Beside it, a small wooden carving of a bear cub he'd made years ago, during a lonely winter. He sat by the window again, waiting, not with expectation but reflection. Hours passed. Then came the sound. A low rustle. Heavy steps. The faint snuffle of a familiar nose. The mother bear emerged first, cautious and deliberate, her breath visible in the chill air. The cubs followed, tumbling quietly behind her. She sniffed the porch, paused at the empty bowl and looked toward the window. Daniel met her gaze. For a fleeting moment, there was no glass between them, only understanding. The bear lowered her head to the carving, nudged it gently, then turned to her cubs. Without taking anything, she led them back toward the trees. No hesitation. No hunger. Just quiet retreat. It was a goodbye. Daniel watched until the last glimmer of movement disappeared into the forest's dark embrace. He felt something close within him, not loss but peace. What they shared was never meant to last forever. It was meant to remind him, and perhaps the bear, that kindness doesn't need to be sustained by exchange. Sometimes, it's enough to exist once, purely and without expectation. He stepped outside, barefoot, feeling the cold wood beneath him. The night was quiet again, but it wasn't empty this time. It was alive, with the invisible threads that connect all living things, fragile but real. He whispered into the dark, "Thank you." The wind stirred through the pines, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine sap, no different than before and yet completely changed. Weeks later, Daniel would still leave his window open some nights, not to call them back but to remember. He'd see the carving weathering slowly on the porch, and know that not all friendships are meant to be kept, some are meant to be honored. And every so often when he'd walk through the forest trail, he'd spot paw prints along the path, distant, fading but still there. Proof that kindness travels further than footsteps. Winter crept in quietly that year. The first snow came without warning, soft, patient flakes that melted on the porch railing before layering the forest in white. Inside the cabin, Daniel sat by the fire, the journal open on his lap. He hadn't written in it for months. The last entry was from the day before he first saw the bear, when the forest still felt like a stranger. Now it felt like a neighbor who'd moved away but left memories in every corner. The pen hovered above the page for a long moment before he began. December 9th. The bowl is gone again. So are they. But I don't feel the emptiness I feared I would. I feel equilibrium. He paused, thinking about the word. Equilibrium. Balance. That was the lesson, wasn't it? Not to erase the line between human and wild, but to see it clearly, and still choose respect. He kept writing. When the bear took my food, I thought I was giving. When she brought berries, I thought I was understood. But maybe neither of us was helping the other. Maybe we were both just learning how to exist without fear. The fire crackled softly behind him, the smell of pine smoke curling through the air. Outside, flakes continued to fall, blurring the world into a quiet haze. Daniel wrote slower now, as if each word carried a memory. I realized that kindness doesn't have to change the world. It just has to prove that it can exist in it. The bear didn't need me, but for a brief time, maybe she reminded me that I needed to remember my place here. Not as a ruler. Not as a savior. Just as another creature passing through. He smiled faintly at that thought. Humans always wanted meaning. Stories. Reciprocity. But the forest didn't care for such things, it spoke in actions, not intentions. And yet, that simple exchange, food for berries, silence for trust, had become one of the most profound connections of his life. He turned to the window. Snow now blanketed the steps, the bowl hidden beneath a soft drift. The wooden carving still stood upright, its edges roughened by cold. The sight warmed him more than the fire could. Reaching into the drawer, Daniel placed the journal inside and closed it gently. Not out of dismissal but preservation. Some lessons didn't need constant revisiting. They just needed to be lived. Later that evening he stepped outside, wrapped in a worn jacket. The forest stretched endlessly before him, vast, indifferent, yet familiar. He whispered into the wind, "Thank you for returning what I didn't know I'd lost." Somewhere in the distance, a deep rumble answered, a low, almost imperceptible growl carried through the stillness. Not close. Not threatening. Just present. Daniel froze, smiling softly. He didn't need to see her to know she was there. That was the nature of real trust. It survives without visibility. He turned back toward the cabin, the snow crunching beneath his boots. Each step felt deliberate, grounding. By the time he reached the door, the forest had gone silent again, holding its secrets like it always had. But in that silence, Daniel felt belonging. Not ownership. Not mastery. Just belonging. Early spring brought new sounds to the valley, melting snow dripping from the eaves, the return of birdsong, the soft hum of life rebuilding itself after the silence of winter. For the first time in months, Daniel's cabin wasn't the only place in the forest showing signs of renewal. Down the mountain trail, a park ranger named Elise drove her ATV through the muddy path, surveying animal activity after the long freeze. She wasn't expecting much, maybe a few deer prints, some fox trails, but what she found near the old ridge stopped her. Large paw marks. Deep, clean, fresh. And smaller ones beside them. She crouched, tracing the edges with her gloved hand. A mother and two cubs. The pattern was clear. What wasn't clear was why they were this close to human settlement. Bears were usually cautious after winter, wary and hungry. Yet these tracks didn't circle campsites or garbage areas. They led toward a clearing, and ended near a weathered porch. Daniel's porch. When she arrived, she found the cabin quiet. The windows reflected the pale sky, and smoke rose lazily from the chimney. On the porch sat a small wooden bear carving, half buried in mud, and a man kneeling to clean it. "Morning," Elise called out. Daniel turned, startled at first, then smiled faintly. "Morning. You checking the trails?" She nodded, stepping closer. "Looks like you've had visitors. Big ones." Daniel chuckled softly. "Yeah. I know them." Elise raised an eyebrow, half joking. "You know them?" "Not in the way you're thinking," he said, brushing the carving surface clean. "We had an understanding, I guess." She noticed the scratches on the porch boards, old but deliberate. "They've been coming here for a while?" "Used to," Daniel said, voice low. "Not anymore. Just passing through now." Elise looked around, the quiet calm, the absence of fear. She'd seen too many human wild encounters end badly. But this place felt different. Peaceful. As if boundaries had been drawn not with fences but with respect. She crouched beside the tracks near the steps, studying the spacing. "You must have done something right," she murmured. "They're not aggressive. They're cautious but calm." Daniel looked toward the tree line. Maybe they learned that not all people mean danger. She smiled faintly. "That's rare." He shrugged. "Maybe it shouldn't be." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of pine and thawed soil. Elise followed the trail a few meters into the forest before it vanished among the melting snow. She turned back toward the cabin. "They're moving north. Probably toward the lake. Safe area this time of year." Daniel nodded, relief softening his face. "Good. They'll have space there." For a moment, they stood in silence, two people bound by different duties but touched by the same reverence. Then Elise asked quietly, "You mind if I note this in my report?" He smiled. "Write whatever you want. Just maybe don't call it feeding. Call it listening." She chuckled. "Fair enough." When she left, Daniel watched her ATV disappear down the muddy trail. The forest seemed alive again, not just in sound but in continuity. What began as an unspoken connection between a man and a bear had become something larger. A story moving beyond him, shaping how others might see the wild. Later that evening, as twilight painted the treetops gold, Daniel stood by the porch, holding the carving once more. He didn't know if the bears would ever return. Maybe they didn't need to. Maybe the lesson had already left with them. He placed the carving back on the railing and whispered, "Stay safe, my friends." Far off, carried by the wind, came a single echo, a low growl fading into the forest's heartbeat. Daniel smiled. He knew the sound. Not a warning. Not fear. Just recognition. 2 months later, Elise was patrolling a stretch of forest road that cut between the ridges, a lonely route where the wild pressed close against the asphalt. The sun was dipping low, throwing the world into that amber hour when everything looked softer, even danger. She'd driven this road countless times, but something about that evening felt different. Maybe it was the stillness. Maybe the silence between the chirps of birds. Or maybe it was the set of tire marks veering too close to the forest edge. Her instincts sharpened. She slowed the ATV, scanning the treeline. That's when she saw movement. A dark shape, low and hesitant, emerging from the brush. Then 2 smaller ones stumbling after it. Her heart jolted. The bears. The mother bear stepped cautiously toward the road, sniffing the air. One cub clung to her side, the other lagged behind, distracted by a patch of dandelions. The moment felt delicate, like a single mistake could shatter it. Elise cut the engine and stayed still. The bear's eyes flicked toward her for an instant, wary but not hostile. Then headlights appeared in the distance, a pickup truck speeding fast. The scene snapped into motion. The cub near the road froze in the glare, small and trembling. Elise's instinct screamed. She leapt off the ATV, waving her arms high, shouting, "Hey! Slow down." Her voice cut through the air, urgent, commanding. The truck screeched, tires spitting gravel. It came to a stop just feet away from the cub, the driver's face pale with shock. The bear roared, rushing forward, not at Elise but toward the cub, scooping it back toward the trees. For a second, human and beast shared the same heartbeat. Fear, protection, relief. Elise stood frozen as the bear looked back one last time. The moment stretched, silent except for the ticking of the truck's cooling engine. There was no aggression in the mother's eyes. Only recognition. A memory, perhaps, of another human who had shown trust once before. Then, without sound, the bear turned and disappeared into the forest, the cubs trailing behind like shadows returning home. The driver stumbled out, still shaken. What the hell was that? You crazy? You could have been killed. Elise's breath came out shaky but calm. Maybe. But so could they. She watched the treeline long after they were gone, her pulse slowly steadying. In her years on the job, she had seen enough to know that most wild encounters ended with fear, bullets, or blame. But this was different. It was a continuation. A quiet inheritance of one man's decency. Later, when she returned to the ranger station, she pulled out her logbook and began writing her report. But instead of a typical incident note, she found herself writing more, like a letter to someone she'd never met. The bears crossed near mile marker 47 tonight. They're alive and cautious, not desperate. Someone taught them once that humans aren't all threats. I think I met that someone. She paused, tapping the pen against the page. It's strange how kindness travels, like scent through wind. You don't always see where it goes, but you know it lingers. As she closed the log, the forest outside her window came alive with night sounds, the hum of crickets, the rustle of leaves, the distant rush of water. Somewhere beyond, a low call echoed, a mother gathering her young. Elise leaned back in her chair, smiling faintly. The forest had its own way of remembering. And somewhere up in that same forest, in a small cabin with smoke curling from the chimney, Daniel stood by the window looking toward the ridges. He didn't know what had happened that evening, but for reasons he couldn't name, he felt a strange sense of calm. Like the forest itself was whispering back to him, carrying news of something good. Sometimes the rewards of kindness don't come in moments we can witness. They return quietly, long after we've stopped expecting them. The forest was alive again. Spring had matured into early summer, streams full, air heavy with pine and wildflowers, and the hum of bees weaving through the open meadows. Elise followed the old mountain road once more, her ATV rumbling gently through the dirt. This time she wasn't on patrol. She was following an instinct, an echo from that night near mile marker 47, when the mother bear and her cubs had vanished safely into the trees. She had promised herself she'd find Daniel's cabin again. Not for an official report, but for something that felt less like duty and more like gratitude. When she arrived, the place looked almost exactly as she remembered it, modest, still, half swallowed by the forest. The porch was clean, though weathered. The small wooden carving of a bear still stood on the railing, its surface faded but dignified. Daniel was chopping wood near the shed. He looked older in the sunlight, calm, grounded, like a man who'd stopped racing time and started listening to it instead. He turned when he heard her approach. "Ranger Elise," he said with a small smile. Didn't expect company today. She smiled back. I figured I owed you a story. He leaned on his axe. That sounds like a good trade. They sat on the porch steps, two people connected by the quiet world around them. Elise told him everything, how she'd found the bear tracks near his cabin, how she'd met the family again on the roadside, how his kindness had carried forward in ways he'd never see. Daniel listened without interruption. When she finished, he looked out toward the trees, his voice barely above a whisper. So they made it. They did, she said. Because of you. He shook his head slowly. No. Because of trust. That's something you can't force on the wild. You can only offer it, and hope it's returned. For a while neither spoke. The forest filled the silence. Distant birdsong, wind through the branches, the rhythmic creak of trees swaying with the afternoon. Finally Elise asked, "Why did you start feeding her?" Most people would have called it dangerous. Daniel smiled faintly. Maybe it was. But danger's not the same as harm. I didn't feed her to tame her. I did it to remind myself that this world isn't just ours. Every now and then we forget that. Elise looked at the wooden carving, tracing the cracks with her eyes. You know, most people wouldn't understand that. Maybe they don't need to, he said quietly. Maybe it's enough that someone does. He stood, walked to the railing and gently lifted the carving. When I first left this out here, it was a symbol of something I wanted to remember. Now, I think it belongs to the forest again. He handed it to her. Would you mind taking it? Maybe leave it near where you saw them last. Let it go back to where it came from. Elise hesitated, then nodded. She took the small carving carefully, as though it were more than wood, as though it held the weight of a shared truth. When she drove back down the ridge, the forest seemed to glow softer, richer, alive with unseen watchers. At the bend where she had stopped that night, she pulled over and walked toward the tree line. There, beside a fallen log where paw prints had once marked the mud, she knelt and placed the carving. The wood felt warm against her palm. She whispered, "He says thank you." The breeze answered, gentle but sure, brushing her hair across her face. In the distance, a low growl echoed, calm, unhurried, content. Elise smiled, standing slowly. The carving sat nestled between moss and roots, a silent monument not to dominance, not to ownership, but to coexistence. She turned toward the road, but before she left, she glanced back one last time. The light was fading through the branches, scattering gold and shadow. For a moment she could almost see them, the mother bear, her cubs, moving quietly through the green, leaving no trace but peace. And somewhere far behind her, Daniel sat on his porch, gazing at the same horizon. He didn't know that his gift had found its way home. He didn't need to. Some stories are complete not when they end but when they are understood. The forest, as always, remembered. If nature could remember every act of kindness we leave behind, how would it remember you?